his basic argument is that China has become a consumer society, and that you cannot understand what is happening in China unless you understand how people look at everything in terms of the question of how do I make money out of it. And so he wants to contend that therefore when you see former generals on TV making extremely hawkish speeches, you shouldn't think that you've just had a hawkish experience. You should think that these guys have found out they could make money by playing a hawk on TV. And he wants to say that people in China understand that that's what those people are doing, and they understand them that way. And they don't become hawks because of those hawkish speeches. And he says that he finds that international analysts who don't live in China take those words too seriously and believe they have a deeper impact than they do. And that therefore, if you don't understand the basic fact that China is now a consumer society with a large middle class and always thinking about how they turn something into a way of making money, to take my own personal example of it, people in Yuan Shikai's home village turning it into a tourist center and promoting Yuan Shikai, despite all we know about Yuan Shikai, as a great patriotic hero, and successfully making money out of it. And anyway, that is, to me, it's a warning about people reading words from China without the context of the real China and the danger of doing so. Okay, we move on. Jeremy?
I prepared a rather skeletal PowerPoint, and I would say my paper is still somewhat unformed. But I hope I can contribute to the discussion nonetheless today. Am I on? You hear me? I start from the proposition that there are two orders, two perspectives, two identities in the Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific, if you like. I take off in part from Zhejiang Eikenberry's notion of the two hierarchies, the economic hierarchy and the U.S. security order in Asia. But I think I'd also like to add to that, it's not in my paper, David Kang's notion of, which in some of this is radically obsolete since he wrote the book in 2000, since he published the book in 2009, but it's still part of China's aspirational order, of a kind of neo-tributary system which is matched in the Chinese imagination by the C-shaped encirclement by the United States. And that's part and parcel of a kind of re-emergence. Somebody said this morning, talked about comparing China to Japan. There's an element of this, and it was also articulated by Xi Jinping once in 2015 in Shanghai about this notion of Asia for the Asians. Since then, he hasn't pronounced exactly the same words again. And then contrasted with the liberal order anchored in the embedded liberalism of post-war multilateral institutions. But as we heard this morning, that which is the contrasting liberal order, has now been contested by none other than the President of the United States. And that causes another ambiguity in the situation that we're finding today. The U.S. ambivalence towards a rules-based order anchored in multilateralism is ambivalent in relation. Somebody said it's simply a great power thing, or it's great power ambitions, but full spectrum primacy anchored in American first. I don't think that these two are, they're incompatible, yes, but I don't think that they have that it's something new, that as a great power, the United States has always great powers are privileged. And they're privileged in the sense that they can try a normative order or they can try a power-based order, and they have a choice. Smaller and medium powers don't have a choice. And China has a kind, as I said, the problem with China is it's not just ambivalence, it's trivalent. It has three discourses which it deploys simultaneously. One is the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, the Chinese dream, which implies a new normal which implicitly, if not explicitly, implies a kind of neo-tributary order, a sinocentric order of where you have an asymmetric exchange of benevolence in return for deference. And it's interesting, by the way, trying to find, you would be hard put to find an explicit Chinese statement about this asymmetric exchange, except that we do find that Xi Jinping starts in 2015, 2013 in some cases, talking about 争缺利益直管, the proper relationship between li, profit or benefit, and yi, righteousness. Very Confucian. So although they don't use deference versus benevolence, and the other thing about li is it's a homonym for another li. The li, profit, is a homonym for li, ritual or rites. So there's an interesting, this using of the homonym to try and at least recreate at least the idea in people's minds that there is this kind of exchange relationship going on. At the same time, China still ascribes to a discourse which in some sense is radically at odds with this asymmetric exchange, which is the doctrine of sovereign equality, which is articulated in the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. And you will find, by the way, if you, the best place, if you want to look for it, I didn't make the PowerPoint of it, but I could have, I said, if I had enough time. Xi Jinping's speech at the Geneva headquarters of the United Nations in 2017 uses both sovereign equality and Westphalia, and then he has all this odd traditional Chinese stuff going on having to do with proper ritual and behavior at the same time. It's in the same speech. So in these 3 discourses, everything depends on whether China is emphasizing its global, regional, or national identity. And for each of these audiences, one discourse is emphasized over the other. I mean, obviously in the national, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation is a self-regarding discourse aimed at Chinese and Chinese nationals. But of course, then he also talks about the Chinese dream is also part of the global dream. And then that comes all kinds of complicated relationship between these two. So between these ambivalences, which are both in the American side and on the Chinese side, the trivalence in the case of China in some ways, the US is poised between realpolitik and a values-based consensus. China is poised between relational dyads of transactional exchange. This is the interesting, I mean, I've been looking at this for some time. I've not necessarily articulated very well in the past. But there is something in the Chinese cultural makeup combined with the regime makeup which prefers relational, quasi-Confucian relational dyads of asymmetric exchange. In which essentially there is always a kind of mutual adjustment in balancing relationships in order to create a kind of harmony. And this ends up, therefore, in a very peculiar form of Chinese multilateralism. There are two discourses, really, in Chinese multilateralism. One is the conventional, Western-style multilateralism, that the WTO rules-based order, etc., in terms of interests embedded in institutions and institutional rules, therefore adjudicating and dividing interests. The other, in terms of simple multilateralism, China uses multilateral organizations as a trellis, as a kind of framework on which to hang various sorts of bilateral relationships. And then there is this third thing, which we see in the BRI, the China-African Forum, the 16+1, in which there is an overarching concept of order, which is then only embedded in bilateral relationships. I call this complex bilateralism, and I've been working on this now. And so China has this framework of complex bilateralism, which is now pursuing fairly systematically in different things, in which China, therefore, is able to have a kind of framework, an overall framework, in which it has simple bilateral relations. Now, I want to emphasize here that I don't want to say that this is all neo-tributary. I think that the complex bilateralism of the BRI and things like that is not the same as the tributary relationship before, because there is an overarching arch of mutual advantage, which is not quite the same as the imperial relationship. Nonetheless, what you do find in this complex bilateral in a final analysis, it is very much self-regarding. It's all China looking out and looking back at itself. Now, what do smaller powers do faced with this? We've had the beginnings of this discussion this morning. And at some level, countries can be comfortable so long as China is talking the global discourse of the rules-based order. And that allows them to sort of frame their bilateral relations with China within a normative order which they themselves can buy into. But it was very interesting is after Xi Jinping made his speech in Davos, it got no takers. I can think of no country whose leader has said that China should be the guarantor of the global multilateral order in accordance with Xi Jinping's speech. Certainly not from the West, and certainly not from other things. Even despite the fact of the second shock and the Trump, etc., still nobody's actually looking for China to be their guarantor. And I think the answer is not so much just Xi's otherwise assertiveness in other orders, but also the discrepancy between the discourses that China is deploying at the same time. You have countries, and here I go into it in my paper, because being self-regarding, I guess, myself, I look at how Australia, New Zealand, and Canada have reacted under these circumstances. In some ways, this is near and dear to me, but Australia in particular, and New Zealand also, were avid participants in the hierarchy, the economic hierarchy, the second hierarchy that Eikenberry talks about. Australia and New Zealand first, then Australia signed free trade agreements with China. At the same time, hedging, yes, in both cases, Australia more strongly than New Zealand through their bilateral and multilateral security relations, especially the bilateral security relationship with the United States. Hedging it at the one hand, but not actually seeing any contradiction between them. You know, Australian prime ministers would sometimes make their first overseas visit to Beijing, even ones on the far right, until recently. And Canada also, I mean, with some ambivalence, more ambivalence perhaps than Australia and New Zealand, for reasons which have nothing to do with values per se, but actually have more to do with geographical position. Canada is shares a very long border with the United States. Most Canadians speak the same language as Americans. So our largest trading relationship is with the United States. So it's much easier to do business with the United States. On the other hand, the Pacific Ocean is quite large. So the idea that Canada could in any way tilt its economic policy towards China as profoundly as Australia did is unlikely. At the same time, however, successive Canadian governments, and particularly our most recent Prime Minister, has come from the first day of assuming office, wanted to improve relations with China, talking about having a free trade agreement with China, actually taking baby steps in the direction of a free trade agreement with China. And I don't need to remind you how that has ended up. But I will remind you in two respects. The arrest of Meng isn't the beginning of the end. The end came in two steps. The first one was our Prime Minister's last visit to Beijing in December of 2017. In December 2017, Justin Trudeau goes to Beijing hoping to initiate free trade agreement negotiations. But Justin Trudeau, in good Canadian fashion, was hoping to square the circle of free trade in a progressive direction. Just as he had the TPP renamed the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, he wanted to have his progressive trade agenda embedded in the negotiations with China. And Xi Jinping said, no, you won't put labor and the environment and women into a free trade agreement. End of story, go home. Sort of like it's Canada's Lord McCartney moment. So that was the first step in which, and Canada then said, well, we're going to still keep trying, exploring, we're going to try to have a free trade agreement. But clearly, Canada didn't have the leverage to get Xi Jinping to bow to the Canadian small L liberal agenda in its free trade negotiation. The other one was a blow, where again not initiated, was last fall. As you know, Mr. Trump wanted to renegotiate the North American Free Trade Agreement. 80% of our trade is with the United States. This is obviously important to Canada. We've spent a lot of energy negotiating this at all levels. The United States managed to get Mexico to agree first before they brought Canada in. And then at the last moment, I'm told, actually, like 2 days before, within a week of it having to be submitted to Congress, the United States inserts a clause 10A in the USMCA, which states that any member of this agreement that must give notice before initiating free trade negotiations with a non-market economy, And if it reaches such an agreement, the United States or the other members can terminate with 6 months' notice the free trade agreement. So this was like a last thing that this was inserted in. Essentially, it was only brought up in negotiation in September 2018, and Canada did sign. It hasn't ratified yet. Neither has American side ratified. But so this was before the Meng case. So already the writing was on the wall, and I think that in some sense suggests why the Chinese side was so vehement and violent in the Meng case, because it sees Canada as tilting in the trade war. The trade war was already on in September 2018, so it makes Canada as tilting. And so now, at the same time, I'm not as pessimistic. I have my own version of triangles that I want to end with here. I don't think that the small and medium countries actually represent a full side of the triangle. We're too weak. Instead, what you have is a structure of a kind of plumb line pendulum, which sort of reacts to the forces between the two. And like the Heath paper this morning, actually, I think this is actually stabilizing in the end. That what happens is with ASEAN and the smaller countries reacting between these two, there's a kind of countervailing forces that keep operating, which keeps the two rival sides, not so much in balance, but in a kind of tension between them, in which, in their tension between them, they're trying to keep the attention of the smaller powers in a way which doesn't allow them to anybody to balance against each other. And I think that there's this, way I would conceptualize is that kind of thing. And as China moves out of balance, if you like, it'll be forced to move back into balance over time. And that's where I would see the thing going, and I'll stop here and wait for your questions.